Hello, Terry Caliendo from Dedicated Managers here again. In the last video, I said I was going to go on and talk some more about the code, so that's what I'm going to do here. Talking about loading up the main interface for a particular caregiver. So if we start at the dashboard, I talked about loading these in a loop, going out and getting the collection and pulling that back and looping through it. And then now we're talking about getting into one of those and talking about how does the information get loaded, how does the view get loaded, and you know, how does everything happen, I guess. So I did talk about that this view is actually, these are child views of a parent client container view. So I talked about the routing, and that the route would ultimately load this client container, which then loads the individual different types of templates. So if the kinship child ID is present, and I talked about that in the last one, if that's present through the calls, through the routing, it's going to end up loading these two entities. These two are currently mutually exclusive, right? They're opposite. They're the same variable. One has a not symbol. So if kinship child income ID is not shown, then obviously I want to show the kinship child itself. If the kinship child ID is there, then I want to show the kinship child income ID is there, then I want to show the kinship child income. So that is loaded through a component. That component comes from, here's the kinship child loaded here, and so that's tied to the kinship child component. So that loads the two pieces. The two things you see there, the three things maybe: the kinship child, the incomes, and that is all that's probably on that screen. So kinship child. I was looking at the wrong thing. That's if we were in this view. Kinship child incomes. We actually did not have that variable available. If we are just in this view for the caregiver, we've only got the kinship caregiver ID available. That comes through as a prop. So when I go to my client container, the kinship child is not there. Others in household is not there. Those are the ifs, and then the else runs. So I know to run the primary kinship caregiver template or component. So where does that come from? Well, that comes again from the components. It's loaded by this import, which comes from the primary kinship caregiver view. So that's this view here, and that's where we get the primary kinship caregiver. We see the kinship children, and we see the others in household. So kinship caregiver, kinship children, and others in household. And again, I think I talked about this in the last video. Kinship children is a list. It's the V card is what gives it. That's Viewtify. That's what gives it this nice look with the little bit of shadow. I'm telling it to do a card. Remember, this is Google. Viewtify uses Google's look of material. That's why it's got that look. And so then I do a list, and I loop through that list, and it's got a person icon. That's what this is right here. And then I output the last name, comma, first name, middle name. So that's what's happening here. Last name, comma, first name, middle name, if there is one. This one, obviously, the middle name is not set. So you can click the back button, or you can follow the breadcrumbs. That's what's great about this routing component. And so, you know, that gets populated, and that comes from a kinship children variable, which is looped over. And what is that kinship children variable? That is, again, a computed variable that I reach out to the store. So if it hasn't been loaded yet, if the current entity is empty, and this should actually be better. There's a chance that the kinship child could be there but empty. But regardless, if things haven't loaded yet, what I'm trying to do here is if things haven't loaded yet, return null, which a loop over a null object just shows nothing. That's why when it first loaded, when it first loads, you'll see that it's empty, and then it reaches out to the store, and there it just popped in. So when it first, oops, let's get rid of that. When it first loads, you know, for the children, this is returning null because nothing is formed yet. And then once the call to the database goes out and fills in the entities, and there's a kinship child, now it can go and populate it with the kinship child entities and loop over them. So, and that can be seen here. The current entity kinship child, there's two of them, 1, 2, and if we get the names, there's Anthony Caliendo M, Anthony Caliendo M, and David Caliendo, David Caliendo. So it's looping over that variable. Now if I go back in time over here, if we go back to the base state, so this lets me go back in time. It doesn't affect up here, apparently. It's just shows me my inspector. So when it first loaded, you know, my current entity was null, which is this state here. It's null. You know, it returns this is null, and then it's negated to true. So if true, return null, so it returns nothing. And then as things progress, sooner or later, here's the primary kinship getting loaded. You know, and there's the kinship children getting finally loaded. So that's when the reactivity of view kicks in and goes back and populates those. So that's why it starts out as empty, and then those asynchronously, these things come and pop in later. Now, how does that asynchronous activity happen? Well, when the client container is first loaded, it has a created function. So if I take a step back, anytime we load a new route, if we're not loading the same route, so if I was switching from this guy to, you know, another, you know, something different, it would not call the created function, I don't think, because it reuses the component because it's already loaded. But if I change, and it destroys the components and then reloads them. So when I come from, you know, if I go back from here, actually we can look and see. Let me go to the console and clear. And so now the question is, when I go back to the Terry, do I get, here's the, and this I have in my code to do that. Primary, so the created function was loaded. So when I went back, it did reload it because it had destroyed the view. But if I was to go like this and change it to just something random, I'm betting I won't get the client container load. Oh, because I'm hitting enter and not clicking a link, it's reloading the entire application. So that doesn't work. Anytime I hit enter like that, I'm reloading the entire application. So of course all of the initial created functions are going to run. If I click on a link within it, now I'm just changing the view, and view is updating this. It doesn't reload the application. So here it did reload the view, and obviously when I go into it and come back, the view created function is showing up again, and that's just me in code saying, hey, in the primary relative caregiver, in the created function, I just, in all my functions when they create, I console log out that, hey, it was created. So that's why that is showing up there. Anyway, so the initial dashboard, when it's loaded, calls the dashboard functions, but when we start getting into this is when we start calling the container component. So if we look at the index, the dashboard calls its own component, but the client the everything else pretty much that has to do with my major routing loads the client container component. So whatever the route may be, it's still loading the client container. And the reason I did that is I realized that no matter what view I'm in, if I'm in the child view, I still need information about its parent in order to indicate in the visual screen that, you know, this child is connected to somebody. And how do I link back? I need the IDs to link back to the parent. And so I'm always going to have to load the parent entity anyway, because to get back to it through the breadcrumbs and whatnot, I need to know this information. Whoops, I didn't mean to click that. I need to know this information, and I can't load this entity's information, which is first name and last name, without loading its the entity itself or making a call to the Firestore. So pretty much whatever level I'm on, I am going to have to pull the entity for its entire stream. So it's going to, if I'm on, if I'm all the way down at the child, I still have to load its parent kinship caregiver in order to get the name to go back to it. So that's why I put all this stuff in one client container, because I'm going to have to call the root entity anyway. So now it's all automatically loaded because I'm always loading the client container. And so anytime I load the client container for anything, the client container reaches out and gets that entity, and then you'll see in code that I actually go down and recursively get all the entities related to it. So I'll walk through that now. So when client container is first loaded, remember index.js is this is my routing component. Whatever route is loaded, I call client container. Client container loads, and it calls its created function. So it is going to load this stuff. And going back to what I said before, you'll see that actually, so when I switch between these, the caregiver view shows up. Notice that the initial client container view does not show up when I go deeper. So I'm going deeper and deeper, and I'm running the created functions on the deeper functions, but I'm not rerunning that client container until I actually leave this client and go to another. So if I go back to dashboard, now that view is destroyed. So now when I come back into it, I'm calling the client container again. So those are the times the client container gets called. And once I get into this view, when I start digging down further, I don't want to reload my root level entity because I've already loaded everything. So again, now let me get back to this. This is the created function within the client container. That's the first thing gets loaded. And what does it do? Well, it says if we have already loaded the root level entity, the highest of the parent entities, we need to then do some further checking, right? If the entity has already loaded. If the entity hasn't loaded, this is a new load. So go and get the entity that's referenced by the primary kinship caregiver ID that was passed in, and the collection, which is primary kinship caregiver, that's my root collection. So anytime client container is loaded, it's going to try and load the current caregiver that we're trying to load if it needs to. If it doesn't, then it does nothing. I mean, if it's already there and we aren't trying to change a new root level. In other words, this primary kinship caregiver ID hasn't changed since the last time, then this is false. So then I'm just not doing anything after the if statement. If the ID has changed, in other words, if I'm going from this view to this view through a link that I click, which I don't even have possible here, but if that was to happen, this is now new, which is this parameter here, this primary kinship caregiver ID that gets passed through as a prop in the routing. It's something that is not, which is currently in the store. So let's see here. Yeah, so it's I'm not trying to add a new one, or the current entity primary kinship caregiver that is loaded has the old ID. This is the new ID being passed in, so it won't have that property. So then this will evaluate to, that'll be false, which evaluates to true. Then so this gets run, and what I need to do is, if I'm changing the IDs, if I'm changing the caregiver that I want to look at, I want to delete all the I want to delete all the current entities in the global component, and then I want to go and start over. So you can see this is the same as this. It's just if I'm trying to change users, I first have to zero everything out so that I don't go and double up my container. So that's actually looking at this right here, this current entity. So the primary relative caregiver on this is 919. And if I was to load this AF, remember that was like how it was before. Well, let me just reload it. So, nothing changed here. That's why it didn't change. Then it's 919. That's the current one. If I was to somehow link to something that was different, that key here under primary kinship caregiver would be different. That is this check here. So then it runs that. Now, when we first run it, though, so when I'm on here and I first run that, so if I hit enter here, it's now reloading the entire application. Everything is starting over from scratch. And so the first thing that happens is that client container is loaded, and then I can see I've got new load, which means that this ran here. I console log this out, so none of this ran because it's an if-else statement. This was skipped because the entity it was a brand new application load. It reloaded the application. None of the data was stored. So I go out and I get the entity that I'm trying to get to, which is the brought in by the link. This is passed in through routing. And so I go out and I get that entity on the primary kinship caregiver because this is my root entity, I'm saying. So I go and get that. So let's take a look at that dispatch function. So in the store, so I'm dispatching to the store, get entity by container. And so there's the function there. And remember, I pass in this object. If I go back to client container, I'm passing in an object. These brackets are the object with keys doc ID and collection ID, and that doc ID and collection ID are set to what I'm trying to currently get, which is that root level entity. So that gets passed in here. So if what I'm passing in is add, it's not. It's got it's this doc ID is actually this. It's the 919 is passed into the client container through the primary kinship caregiver ID prop, and that's put into doc ID. So on my store, here's doc ID. It's not add, so I'm going to skip that. So I'm going to get an existing. I know that there's something I want to get out there. And so this is the function. A lot of the functionality I have to do. I'm not going to get too detailed into it, but because my state of everything starts out as null, let me scroll to the top here. Because entity listeners, current entity, those things all start out as null. You can't add properties at a deep level unless you build them up. So I have to build up the fact that entity listeners is an object. I could have started with an object, but I did that. Then I have to add this property to it. And then in order to add this property, so I can't add this property or even check this property unless I know that these other ones are there. If this one is not there, if this property is not on this object, then this will return an error that I'm trying to access a property on an what is it? I can't even think right now. Unidentified. It's not unidentified. It's a null, not null. I gotta take a break. Undefined. Undefined is the word. If I try and access this property on this thing, it's undefined. It gives you an error of trying to access a property on undefined. You can't access a property on undefined. I wish you could. JavaScript would be so much easier. Granted, there'd probably be a lot more errors somewhere. But if I didn't have to do all this checking, it would be great. But this is what allows me to keep my database very dynamic and grow as I feel like it. Is that I start out null and then I just build the fields on top of it. And what that allows me to do then is in the interface level, if I just want to add a new text field, I can just add it and then everything else will be figured out. I don't have to go into the database and define that field. I just define it here on the front level, and when it gets saved and everything gets figured out. So you got to do a lot of checks for that. So that's what's all happening here. Here we're removing any old info so that when, remember, my global object stores the current entity. So, and since the properties are all pretty much the same, if I didn't zero that out and I switched between from Terry and I switched back to Bob, notice how it was empty and then it popped in. If I hadn't zeroed that out, then it would have shown my name and then switched to Bob. So that's why I gotta clear that out. Actually, you know what? I may need to go back and look at that as I'm talking here, because I had this happening before when I wasn't doing so deep on the way I was tracking things. So at one point, this current entity, the kinship child, I wasn't storing by the key on there. I was just storing this data directly on the kinship child object, but that was before I realized that I would need to have multiple children show up. So then I had to key them in some way. Anyway, long story, that may not be necessary. But then we start getting into the listeners. So this is where that recursive functionality is going to happen. So this is calling the store. This right here is I'm calling the Firestore, and I'm getting the collection ID, which is what I passed in, and then the that's kinship, primary kinship caregiver, and then this is the doc ID that I passed in, which ultimately is this. So those are those two fields. That's the first one. That's the second one. Ultimately, that's what it becomes here. Now remember, this function here is abstracted so that I can get any entity at any level. It's not just getting the primary relative caregiver. That's why I pass in the various ones. And then after that call happens, so this call is made, and it returns a promise, which is a function that gets called. So this entire bit here, all this stuff and down for a while, that all gets called anytime Firebase sees a change. So when somebody on another real-time client makes a change that affects what I'm currently listening to, that affects this doc ID, this container, this collection, and this document, if there's a change somewhere else, so if somebody else is on this same client on another browser somewhere and they make a change like this, that's going to call this listener, and it's going to run what's inside this listener. Now the reason I set that listener Firebase equal to this thing is so that I can clear out that listener later on if I want to, and I just I have a list of all my listeners so that I know what entities have loaded and what listeners there are. So primary kinship caregiver is the root that's loaded right now, so I'm listening for any changes on that. I'm also listening for any child activity. So if something changes here, that's going to call this listener here. This is just a function that when you execute it, it closes the listener. But now I'm tracking all my listeners so that when I switch to a different person, so I'm on Bob now, if I switch to Terry, all my listeners are going to change. If I didn't close out those listeners, they would still be hanging out there, and any changes that come through would still be brought into those listeners. So it's just wasting, bandwidth. So I want to be able to kill those listeners. So that's why I store the listener. I store what's returned from Firebase, and that's what I'm keeping track of in that variable there. And then anytime it's first loaded, so Firebase will go out, it'll get the information, and then it'll run this on first load. And if doc exists, this is a variable that happens with various situations, but it returns when somebody deletes the document is not found or the document is deleted somewhere else. So that's not going to get called on the first run. What's going to get called is this else statement. And so what I'm going to look for first is any nested collections. So if we look at, remember we're loading primary kinship caregiver, and it has nested collections, kinship children and others in household. So, and that's stored in the primary kinship caregiver. This is the nested collections that it has. Let's see, where's the 919? There's the 911. It had 919. It has nested collections of two kinship children. So it has the kinship child variable. Remember, this was from before. This was something I created in the last video. It's not part of my application. I can actually go back and that's going to take too long. Let's just go back to here. So pretend like that doesn't exist. This is the kinship child. Now there's no others in household underneath it yet because I haven't created one. So if I go and I create an other in household under Terry, so let's make it Johnny Utah, and now that's created. And so now if I go back to Terry, he's got two children and an others in household. So now this should get updated with the others in household, which is not there. Well, that's actually a bug, something that's currently broken. I took a pause there and went back and looked, and if I create that, so notice I created that and it's gone. If I create that Johnny Utah again, geez. If I create it, it's here, so it's in memory, but it's not actually tying it so that if I reload this, it's gone. So I didn't tie that right when I built it. I got to go look at that. That's a bug, but you can see what's happening here is the kinship children is there. So that's actually, if I just want to continue forward with this, it's looking here, finding the kinship child, and it sees two of them. That's what's getting loaded here when we do this nested collections. So I'm looking at the nested collections object that's returned. So the doc.data is the object that is returned from this call. So the Firebase call here. Remember, anything below it down here is the callback function that gets called anytime an update comes in. So if the update comes in, I take a look at the nested collections on it, and that's just a property that I store right here, and then I loop through that. So you can see that there's some looping going on, and ultimately I loop through those collections to get each of the child entities. So what happens is this is a recursive look. Remember, the first time it's called, if we go back, I've been talking so long it's probably hard to remember. But when we called that client container, we called get entity by container, and so that goes into the store, calls this function, and then ultimately we're calling that Firestore function, which is now going and getting those entities, those sub-entities down here. Here's that nested collections. And then you can see I do a check to see if I've already got a listener for it, I don't need to set up another listener. That's what allows me to do things recursively, is that I'll just ignore something if I've already found it. So if if I'm trying to load an entity that I've already loaded, I've already got a listener on it, I'm not going to do anything. I'm only going to do it if there is not already that function, that entity, which is here. That's what that's these entity listeners. So if there's already a listener set up, it's not gonna go and get it. And so that's why I can call on a lower level page, I can recall this nested entity, and it doesn't write over. It just doesn't do any extra work. It just ignores things. And then ultimately, it takes that object that was returned, that doc.data object that was returned after doing all the nested entity checking. It returns the updated information on the object. So it calls initialize current entity with the new information. So if I look for initialize current entity, it calls this, and all this does is basically just puts that object on the entity. So that's just updating whatever the entity that was called. In this case, sorry, it was the primary caregiver. It's actually just putting this object here on this guy. So I've been talking for 30 minutes here trying to walk through this, and I can see that this is pretty, it's very intense trying to describe what's going on. And there's a lot of recursiveness going on, and it just keeps going and going, but hopefully you can see that this really is a relatively small amount of code for what's all happening. It looks like a lot as I scroll through, but every single entity that's loaded calls the same function. Where is it? Every time I try to load an entity, I call this, no matter where I'm coming from. If I'm coming from the client container, if I'm coming from the a lower, like if I come, let's look at others in household, let's look at its created function. If I'm trying to add something, I still call that same function, but it knows that if things are already loaded, it knows to ignore the other entities that have already loaded. So again, I understand that's not extremely helpful, but hopefully that helps you dive into the code a little bit and understand a little more. I can't talk anymore, so I think I'm done at this point for the amount of updates I'm going to do. The main thing was just to show how cool this is getting. It's starting to look good, and I can build entities and nested entities, and you see the list grow. So some cool stuff going on. Pretty good update. Anyway, Terry Caliendo signing out. Dedicated Managers. Take care. Have a great day.